Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment Forum webinar series. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank A-Site, our lead technical partner, for their support. My name is Ronan O'Hara, and today over the next hour we'll be looking at circling the square, the possibilities and promise of a circular built environment. Construction, as we know, is one of the largest sectors of today's global economy. It represents 13% of GDP and approximately 7% of global employment. It also, however, consumes half of the world's resources extracted each year and is responsible for nearly 40% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions. These damning facts and figures, of course, through a different lens, represent an opportunity to think differently and to do differently within the built environment. Applying circular economy principles to the built environment can support green growth that is resilient to volatile material prices, maintain essential natural ecosystem services, reduce carbon, create urban areas that are more livable, productive and convenient, and of course create new and sustainable sources of employment for the future. So there is clearly a lot to be excited about when it comes to the possibilities and promise of the circular built environment. Against this backdrop, before I introduce our panel, I would like to introduce Edwin Poots MLA, Northern Ireland's Minister for the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, who has kindly prepared a welcome address which I know will resonate with all of us.
Good afternoon everyone, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this World Built Environment Forum event today, which I know has been organised as a COP26 event as part of REACT, the Festival for a Sustainable Belfast. I have been attending COP26 this week, while also attending to other executive business, which means I'm not able to speak to you live. Nevertheless, I am keen to be involved and I'm grateful for our ICS for inviting me to be part of the event. As Northern Ireland's Environment Minister, my focus and that of my department is to ensure that sustainability is put at the heart of everything we do by taking a partnership approach with business and communities and on supporting them to look after the environment and to be its custodian for future generations. Tackling climate change is a key priority for my department, and we're committed to driving forward action to tackle climate change, and in doing so ensure that Northern Ireland as part of the UK is recognised on the global stage for leading by example. I am aware that there's been significant research and action happening locally across the built environment sector in this regard. For instance, the delivery of the hugely impressive Southwest College's Earn campus, which is the world's first and largest passive house premium rated building. And in February 2020, the Northern Ireland Assembly declared a climate emergency, and to meet our commitments to reduce emissions and tackle climate and environmental challenges, I have prioritised the development of a green growth strategy which my department is leading on behalf of the Northern Ireland Executive. The draft green growth strategy, which has been launched and is now in the consultation, will tackle the climate crisis by balancing climate action with the environment and the economy. Green growth is a multi-decade strategy which will set out the long-term vision and solid framework for tackling the climate crisis in the right way and help us to meet our targets to support the UK's goal of achieving net zero by 2050. An associate action plan will set out what we must do within each sector to meet specific greenhouse gas emission targets, which will deliver a cleaner environment, green jobs and more efficient use of our resources within a circular economy. The changes that must happen will impact each and every person living and working in Northern Ireland, and this will impact on future generations, part of the reason I was so keen to speak to a group with such a wide range of skills, knowledge and expertise here today. We can't survive without buildings. They provide us with places to live, work, socialise. However, at this moment in time, our buildings are among our big emitters of greenhouse gases in Northern Ireland, and this presents challenges. I believe there are also many opportunities for a more sustainable built environment for us all. I believe that the opportunities this bring can be the beginning of a green revolution, the next industrial revolution, which can help rebuild our economy following the COVID-19 crisis. Green jobs will be created, expanding the skill set of many into new and evolving career paths and opportunities that perhaps don't yet exist. Through Green Growth, my department is working with others in a journey to decarbonise Northern Ireland, including across our built environment. So today I'm sure you'll hear of practical examples of ways in which our buildings, new and existing, are being adapted to be more sustainable. There's also an obligation on each one of us to act, behave and think differently. All of you here today, myself included, have an opportunity to play across all sectors, business organisations, and as individuals we'll have choices ahead of us where we must decide on how our decisions may impact upon the environment around us. Some decisions will be easier than others. The change needed will require substantial investment from both public and private, and in our draft Green Growth strategy, my executive colleagues and I have made a series of commitments, one of which is to lead by example, and that's why we have committed to delivering a government estate and fleet with net zero operational carbon emissions and ensure there is a Green Growth aligned procurement strategy for all government spend. But that in itself won't be enough. If we want to make Belfast and our other settlements more sustainable, we must collaborate on the development and management of land, real estate, construction and infrastructure to ensure we have buildings which are built in the right ways with as many locally and sustainably sourced materials as possible, that aren't heated or powered in fossil fuels and whose construction and maintenance will ensure green jobs as part of a circular economy for all. Much of the success of the Green Growth strategy will depend on how well we work together. The launch of the strategy has kick-started a period of consultation until the 21st of December. We want as many people from Northern Ireland to respond and have their say on this important issue. Further details and the opportunity to respond to the consultation are on our DAERA website. Through investment, innovation, research, development and working together, we can protect our future. We will and we must act today to protect tomorrow. Thank you, and I wish you all every success for the rest of this event and in all of your endeavours.
Thank you, Minister, for those words of commitment and encouragement. Now, I'd like to move on to introduce our panel. And if I could ask Professor Usha Iyer to introduce herself and say a couple of words about her professional relationship with the circular built environment.
Many thanks, Ronan, and good evening from Melbourne, Australia. I'm based at the School of Property, Construction and Project Management at RMIT University, and I co-lead the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program for the One Planet Network, which has been working on circular economy for the last 4 years. It is in this relationship with the program, as well as my own professional relationship in teaching and research, that I've been working on circular economy, both within the Australian context, but also in a global context.
Thank you, Usha. And could I now ask Alan Muse from our ICS to introduce himself, and likewise, Alan, if you could say a few words about your kind of involvement with the circular built environment.
Thank you very much, Ronan. Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Alan Muse. I'm Global Head of the Built Environment at the RICS. The RICS is committed to bringing professional toolkits, standards, skills, upskilling to bear on the enormous issue that's in front of us in terms of improving sustainability in the circular economy and construction. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Back to you, Ronan.
Thank you, Alan. And then finally, but last but not least, Kevin O'Grady, Chief Executive Officer at Urban Mass Limited. Kevin, could you say a few words and introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'm Kevin O'Grady. My interest in circular economy come from a quantity surveying background, working many years with Arup and their links to Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I was recently working with the RICS on the government's new procurement process called the Value Toolkit. I'm a business advisory consultant, but also the CEO for Urban Mass, which is a net zero autonomous mobility solution, which is planned to be installed 200 years after Stephenson's rocket and locomotion in the same location, with the heart of innovation and the focus on environmental circular economy. And as we heard earlier, the green revolution. And a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant, Kevin, thank you. So we have registrations, believe it or not, today from over 22 countries, including the likes of Trinidad and Tobago, the United States, Saudi Arabia, India and Botswana, which is fantastic. Do please submit questions to our panel as it really helps to kind of bring the conversation to life. And if you're new to these webinars, can I point out that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we will try our best to pick these up as we go throughout the session. Okay, so moving on to our questions. Usha, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. And can I ask, in your opinion, how important is the circular economy to meeting the UN Sustainability Development Goals and net zero obligations?
Thanks for the question, Ronan. Perhaps for the benefit of the audience, I should mention that the Sustainable Development Goals came into effect on the 1st of January 2016, and they superseded the Millennium Development Goals. The difference between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals is that the Millennium Development Goals focused only on the developing world. With the Sustainable Development Goals, there is an implicit expectation that all of us, the least developed countries, as well as the developed countries, all play part in our quest towards sustainability and the recognition that we have only one planet. Mm-hmm. In terms of circular economy, the Sustainable Development Goals actually don't mention circular economy anywhere. However, the principles that Sustainable Development Goals have been underpinned by and the principles upon which circular economy is based are very similar. So some see circular economy as a subset of sustainability, some see circular economy as sitting alongside sustainability, but effectively it's a triple bottom line approach, ensuring that we meet that nexus between environmental, social, and economic. I suppose from a circular economy perspective, it resonates well with the economic side of the argument and the equation. And there is certainly a lot of interest in terms of ensuring and decoupling environmental issues with economic issues. And I think if you are on a trajectory looking at circular economy, there's certainly some support, development, and certainly business cases to be made, because you can support environmental issues, you can negate environmental impacts, but at the same time also ensure that there are jobs that are created in the process.
Very good, Usha. Could I just ask a little supplementary there, because I'm mindful Kevin's a QS and I'm a building surveyor, and I'm kind of, in our world, that kind of plays through, I think, in what we would call the whole life perspective or the life cycle perspective. Or have you any kind of additional thoughts or views on that and their relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Certainly. I think for most of us who work in the building industry, we know the importance of design and we know the importance of life cycle thinking. And if we don't get the fundamental bearings in terms of design, material use, the right thermal orientation, etc., then the operation of the building becomes a big issue. So getting that balance between the embodied energy and the operational energy is important. From a circular economy perspective, if we are going to be looking at buildings as also urban mining opportunities for materials, then the role of disassembly or deconstruction of buildings also becomes quite important. So the life cycle argument, I think, is most important now than ever before. Also, from the perspective of energy efficiency and building codes, as we develop greener building codes and as buildings become more and more efficient, the split between embodied energy and operational energy shifts. So typically it's been on an 80-20 rule, where you have 20% of embodied energy and 80% of the life cycle energy is towards operations. As buildings are getting more and more efficient from the energy perspective, the embodied energy equation is actually increasing. And this is something that we really need to think about, particularly in the new growth areas of the world.
Fantastic. There's lots in that. Kevin, I'm going to move on to you if it's okay.
That's fine.
And I'm interested in knowing, are circular economy practices becoming mainstream? I mean, What do you see day to day?
Yeah, I suppose if we think about the tenders that are going out, and I suppose which stage the project's in, if we're talking about sort of contracted tenders, are there requirements within the tenders asking for circular economy requirements? I suppose at the REBA, end of REBA stage 3 or REBA stage 4, there's less likely chance to actually influence the circular economy of those stages. Rather, if it's at the inception stage or design stage, we have more potential from which to influence the materials that are selected for these projects. Sort of early REBA to 0 stage, we see clients asking for life cycle costing estimates to be done, and using that data from which to make informed decisions about keeping materials in use for as long as possible, and actually seeing out the difference between different options of buildings and what their maintenance cost would be and the ultimate value at the end. So looking at reducing landfill, overall social benefits, and in a recent sort of inward investment in Europe, they had a large factory in Poland where they looked at the whole life carbon value that was measured using the European standard 15978 and using the RICS guidance, which is the whole life carbon assessment. So for the built environment. So you see clients now coming more and more online, trying to mainstream and trying to get the data from which to make these informed decisions. And we've even seen the UK government with the value toolkit, which we were working with RICS, REBA, Construction Leadership Council, the Construction Innovation Hub, all coming together to understand how you measure these values on projects. And they've done that through 4 key pillars: the human capital, the social, natural, and the produced capital. Obviously, the produced capital looks at the capital cost and return of investment. But so maybe they're not asking directly for circularity, but in the actual tenders, they're asking for the traditional way, like through life cycle costing and environmental assessments. But that data will inform circular economy.
And Kevin, I've got to ask this, does being circular necessarily mean more cost? The way the reality is that many clients are cost obsessed, or are we reaching a point whereby actually it can be cost neutral or even economically beneficial?
Yeah, definitely right. I suppose if we look just in Europe, the construction makes up more than 1/3 of the total energy consumption, where sort of like over the lifetime, 40% of construction waste is recycled or reused. So it's a huge story. And one of the clients that we work for, I've told this story quite a few times about my rubber mat story, and it goes down to the individual asset where we were asked to look at the difference between different options in the front entrance of stations, and we looked at the difference between a conglomerate floor tile or a rubber mat. And the rubber mat is very cheap and quick to install. Every 2 years you can turn it over and then get another 2 years use out of it, but ultimately that rubber mat will be assigned to landfill. So if you did a whole life cost assessment of that rubber mat over the life cycle of that station, yes, it's cheap initial capital cost, but compared to putting a conglomerate floor tile that may increase in cost over time if it's a rare type of tile, the cost was far immeasurably higher for the cheaper outset design. So when people think it costs more to do circular interventions, you have to look at the individual intervention that you're doing, and reducing landfill from some of the selected materials is a key part to actually focus on. That it doesn't always cost money. Sometimes you can increase the end of life value of the asset by selecting the right asset in the first place. So hopefully that my rubber mat story will sort of tell you that hopefully it shouldn't cost more money to take some of these circular initiatives early stage.
And it sounds like better user experience in addition. Kevin, I'm going to just build ever so slightly on that and ask this next question here. Given that we're on to life cycles, etc., how can you ensure circularity of components or products through the life cycle of an asset as a whole?
What, just prove that they're tracked to the end? Is that so So we did a couple of studies for a couple of clients where we looked at building passports, digital passports, trying to track assets, and we worked quite closely with Tata Steel.
Yep.
And Tata Steel lent us to believe and gave us the knowledge that not all steel values, there's a varying quality in steel composition. And that if we don't know the composition of that steel at the end of life, it goes into the sort of common component and the lowest form of steel. So we actually lose that high grade steel from the very outset. So it's like buying a Rolls Royce, taking off all the badges and then trying to sell it on the open market where nobody knows the actual quality of the actual product in the first place. So we wouldn't do that with our own vehicles or our own products. So having this digital logbook with maybe using, and in these examples, we use blockchain to track the asset so that in 50 or 100 years time, there is still a digital record of the composition. The environmental product data is very important, that we request the environmental product data from manufacturers and contractors, and some contractors say this information isn't available, but it's good to push for that data. And once you have that data, that would be immeasurably invaluable to the recycling and getting the highest value of that material later on.
It sounds, Kevin, as though technology and data is a key enabler in deriving those benefits. I mean, are you kind of seeing this? You mentioned blockchain there. Are you seeing linkages through to the likes of digital twin and so on and so forth, and CAFM and?
No, definitely. Next week, we're actually carrying out a major LiDAR scan of an existing building in central London. And the idea is to scan it for its, not only it's the assets that you can see, but also the assets embodied in the building, so that the client can have an appreciation for the materials that may be available at end of life for the full value of the property. So we're carrying out about 3 or 4 different scans of the building to work out the true value of the assets within the buildings, but linking some of those assets back to there. Eventually we will see a reuse market, a market for recycled materials, where people will obviously, because as the cost of materials go up, the actual marketplace for reuse materials, I think, is going to be something that we will see coming on in the next 5 years easily.
Okay, thank you for that, Kevin. It's very interesting because I don't think everybody automatically connects digitization, IT, and data with circularization. Alan, I hope you're not feeling left out there. Sorry, I'm coming to you now. Can I ask, how can circularity be measured and reported? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ronan. And I think this is a really important question. I mean, I think our previous 2 speakers have alluded to the fact that the existing market still provides challenges for widespread uptake of the circular economy and sustainability. But one of the key issues in improving that take-up is actually measurement consistency. I mean, we all know about the well-worn phrase, you have to measure it to manage it. But where this is particularly important in carbon is that there's a paucity of these consistent standards at the moment. And the other point here, of course, in terms of measurement consistency, is that it's the precursor to innovation. And innovation in materials is very important because we're aware of lots of work in terms of lower carbon cement. And cement, by the way, if it was a country, would be the 3rd largest emitter of carbon in the world, which is an astonishing statistic. But we're also aware of work in terms of lower carbon steel and the like. So some of this innovation work has to have a baseline in terms of measurement to see that it's actually improving the situation, and therefore measurement's also important in terms of that innovation. And just coming back to the point that you put to Kevin, actually, and bringing it back home, if you like, in terms of quantity surveying and building surveying, the cost of virgin materials is generally lower than that of recycled materials, and the costs associated with the upskilling and logistics required for circular practices can be substantial. But that's the cost, not necessarily the value, as Kevin alluded to. And this balance needs to shift in terms of that decision making. And it's quite often about trade-offs between capital cost, life cycle cost, and sustainability, where those key decisions are made. And there's also perhaps a lack of consistent industry regulation and certification for material reuse here as well, which is something that we're speaking to the UK government and other governments about. And I think the RICS is very keen to measure the circular approach by adopting, as Kevin's already alluded to, established industry practices such as whole life carbon assessment, and our professional statement refers to that, and life cycle costing, and we have a black book piece specifically dedicated to that, early in a project's decision-making process, including accounting for the residual value of solutions, components and materials, and reduction in the operational expenditures, demolition or end-of-life costs that would allow. And that's why we've developed and are developing international construction measurement standards, which now look at carbon metrics as well. And the third edition, which will be published at the end of November, will encompass a consistent way of reporting carbon at high level on construction projects to compare between markets or between different sectors in the same market. And that will also be aligned to the update of the carbon assessment professional statement, which Kevin's already mentioned, and which will be released in 2022. We're also relaunching our carbon database early in 2022, which will be a repository for some of this standardized data that will be produced from these standards, hopefully. And Kevin's also mentioned the value toolkit, where we're producing our own guidance for project managers and quantity surveyors in terms of looking at construction procurement across a much wider lens than just capital cost and even life cycle costs, so across human, environmental and values as well. And so the whole issue of standards, data and skills is something that we're working on at the RICS to improve this measurement consistency and reporting of carbon issues, Ronan.
Alan, I've a question from the floor, as they say, and I'm going to build, and you may, panel as a whole, want to talk to this. There are two related questions here about the implications of circularity on property values, what might they be, and then will valuation standards inevitably or in due course need to take account of reuse, upcycling, recycling of buildings? So I suppose at its heart, what are the implications of a circular built environment in terms of valuation? Any views? Maybe starting, Alan, with you, and then if others would like to chip in.
Thank you, Ronan. Again, this is a very critical point, and green value is something that obviously the valuation surveying arm of RICS is looking at. This is governed a lot by financial governance, but the fact is that there's a lot of ESG fund money now looking for a home, if you like, in terms of investable, sustainable construction projects, and therefore it's been supposed, certainly in the domestic market, that the lack of sustainable solutions may have an effect on values. In the UK, for example, we've got a very old and large Victorian housing stock, which obviously can be retrofitted and upgraded, but it comes across problems of heritage and planning trade-offs, and also just the practical and cost implications of actually imposing the retrofit. But I think data is becoming available that these issues are beginning to have an effect on value. One of the unfortunate points about data is that it's obviously by its very definition backward looking, and valuers tend to rely on precedent in terms of data in order to make their decisions. But more and more data is becoming available, and it needs to become available in this standardized, consistent way that I talked about before in order to inform future decisions. So I think there are two main planks here that are going to change the approach to green value. One is financial strictures in terms of the sustainability and green agenda, and if you like, the market money looking for a response in terms of sustainable solutions and investment in construction projects, and secondly, the data itself showing that actually there is actually a tangible green value. That's where we are, I think, with it at the moment, Ronan. Work in progress.
That's very insightful. Funny enough, I think I read in the FT at the weekend an article indicating depression of prices associated with market values in with lower levels of energy performance in residential assets starting to manifest.
Definitely.
Kevin and Anusha, have you any additional thoughts on that? The link between circularity in the built environment and asset value?
Yeah, maybe I could just start by expanding on Alan's bit there slightly on the residential one, definitely, because we see a lot of investment and lots of manufacturing for design for manufacturing and design for disassembly. So a lot of modern methods of constructions are coming into the housing market. So if they're designed in factories, built in factories, they can be disassembled and reused. So that's that's key for the residential. But looking at our own as a sort of client doing infrastructure for mobility infrastructure, the commission we have with the National Railway Museum to build the demonstrating shielder, that has been asked to be like, after 2 years, it can be expanded, could be adapted, or it could be taken away. So the clients are asking for the infrastructure not to be a carbon scar on the landscape, but to be a lightweight, reusable, redeployable infrastructure. The stations are super lightweight, the infrastructure is lightweight, so that both in housing, residential and buildings, if it's designed for manufacturing assembly, it can be deconstructed, and that leads into your circular economy.
Very interesting. Usha, I was going to come to you for the next question, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I was, unless you had any comments to add on that last point, just.
Perhaps I will, just a quick one.
Yes.
Putting on the academic hat, this movement that we are heading now in circular economy reminds me a little bit of where we were at in the green building movement 20, 30 years ago. And there's a little bit of, innovation, creativity, taking risks, understanding what works, what doesn't work, and then checking to see what appetite the market has before things become mainstream. So it's a little bit of that happening across a number of different areas in the circular economy space as well. And I think putting on the academic hat, what I would say is I think it's really important that we start taking a little bit more of a systemic view in our educational programs. So we're not just looking at built environment professionals not talking to each other, not engaging with each other, because the collaboration that we need to derive out of taking a circular economy approach is going to become more and more critical. So we need to have the valuers talking to the developers, talking to the the specifiers, to the architects, and so on. And that engagement, I think, at the very start of the project is going to get more and more critical.
I think that's a great point, Usha. I think, we're all part of the same family. We're all working to the same end. I'm going to move us on to our next question here, and it's for Usha. And it's, what are some of the other challenges companies face incorporating circularity, and how can these be overcome?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think doing the work that I've been involved with the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, when we came up with our 10 recommendations for transition to a circular built environment, one of the things that we talked about was procurement practices. And I don't want to go over some of the issues that Alan and Kevin have already talked about, but I think it's really important that processes are put in place to enable green procurement practices. And I think that governments in particular have got an important role to play in this process, because often with large infrastructure projects, governments are involved, whether from a public-private partnership perspective, whether it's in terms of ownership of assets or even fronting up with funds and ideas for the project. So I think examples, for instance, of where we've ended up with the London Olympic Games, and there are lots of examples in Europe where buildings or infrastructure have been built for particular purposes, but have been adapted, and this has been part of the thinking at the design stage. So I think that's pretty important. And I just want to also reiterate some of the points that Kevin made about end of life and getting those materials and components right at the start of the design process and start of the construction process is really, really going to be critical if we are going to be thinking about urban mining down the track. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind at the start of the design and build process.
Usha, you've mentioned two of my hot buttons there, policy and green procurement practices, but I want to actually tie it in with a question from the floor. It relates to the role of government and policy and government expenditure. And the question we have here is, how do we move from what is really organizations, individuals piloting thinking to really mainstreaming the solutions and mainstreaming the wholesale adoption of circularity? Any views or thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's all about, and going back to what you said before, Ronan, we're all part of the same family, right? So we have to have alignment, and we all need to be moving in the same goal or the same direction. I think in some cases, and I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but I've never been more embarrassed to be an Australian before because of what's been happening with COP26 and our government, our federal government, dragging its feet in terms of targets and policies on zero emissions. However, having said that, there have been examples of particular businesses in Australia, state government agencies that have not looked or waited for our federal government to come up with policies and programs, but state-based incentive targets and sometimes even local government incentives and targets that are supporting a move for us to move into a decarbonized future. So I think, while we can try and bring the politics in, and politics does play an important role, and policy does play an important role, there are other ways in which we can approach the problem as well. And there are certainly a number of global industries, building manufacturing industries, that have started looking at green procurement practices, looking at green steel, green concrete, moving away from some of the standard building materials into, for instance, use of timber, and Northern Europe have been doing a lot of work in that space. So there are examples that could be used by companies looking at best practice models from other parts of the world and bringing it into their own countries or into their own industry practices.
I think you're right, Usha. I said to somebody yesterday, I used the phrase, the train has left the station, the journey has started. Alan and Kevin, I'm going to come to you jointly on this next question, if that's okay. Is there a strong connection between circularity and embodied carbon? And just to kind of explore that for our audience a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Rowan. I think there is. I mean, construction materials, if you want to think about it this way, are input flows of embodied carbon, and these emissions are new to the system. So the adoption of circular economic design approaches that allow longer building lifetimes, greater component and material reuse, can reduce that input flow of embodied emissions and ensure the already expended embodied carbon remains in stock. And I think that's the way it needs to be thought about in terms of that connection. And I think a key conceptual shift is to think of buildings not just for their primary purpose, but also as a method of storing thousands of tons of valuable products and materials which can be traded and reused at the end of the building's life rather than just being discarded. And I think this comes back to these trade-offs that I talked about before, and Kevin talked about before at the early design stages. And you know, designers and quantity surveyors and building surveyors need to think about three things here: materials efficiency, using less to do more. Designs really should aim to reduce the overall amount of materials used over the whole lifetime of the building or asset, and taking into consideration if a material choice will result in more replacements of refurbishments, such as Kevin's mat, as well as favouring non-virgin and renewable materials over primary and non-renewable resources. And renewable materials are those usually sourced from resources that can be replenished or regenerated. And Usher's just mentioned timber from sustainably managed forests. The second point is ensuring that materials have a life beyond their initial purpose. So designing for disassembly, I believe it's called, or designing for adaptation and value conservation practices ensure that materials have a life beyond their initial purpose. And these approaches require an understanding of the building and its full component life cycle and potential for reuse to ensure the maximum possible amount of components and materials can actually be dismantled, recovered and reused once their initial use is over. And third and finally, material choice. I mean, some material groups such as metals will lend themselves more easily to being reused, and therefore to higher circular scores if you're trying to score the building. And allowing designers to explore mitigation measures around different material options is very important. But again, to make those choices and trade-offs, we need some way of consistently measuring what these scores are and what these advantages are. And this is where some of the standards that we've talked about earlier come into play.
Very good, Alan. Thank you for that. Kevin, any additional thoughts?
No, definitely agree with Alan. It's the input for circular economy needs the sort of waste that you build to the inputs and the outputs to be equal, so as minimum as possible. And on that sort of rubber mat story, we saw that the initial cost was cheaper, but if you start putting the factors into play about the cost to landfill, and the cost for landfill is going up because we're running out of spaces and how to deal with it. So if you did the proper analysis of the whole life, taking into account the landfill cost, the impact to the environment, and measure them equally, you'll always come up with the right answer over the period of time, and it can be a higher value for the client. So I definitely agree with Alan, and the choice of materials is going to be key. Whether you look at a standard construction, we see that from next year, all residential properties will have solar panels as part of the regulation, and we see that any policy or any change in state, you have to look at the 3 Ps for it to be successful. The first P is taking people along with you, so make sure everybody understands the journey and everybody's trained in which to carry out that change. Policy is very important, and so is process. So one of those P's missing, and you won't get that change in state. And if we're to move to a more circular economy, we need the policy. And I must admit, for the works we've done with the RICS and Construction Leadership Council on the Value Toolkit is hugely welcomed. And the fact that they didn't do that in a silo and mandated it without training, they've actually incorporated feedback from the whole community. There was all of the major consultants were involved in that. So they got the policy right, they've got the people on the journey with them, and they've actually given us the tools in which to value these products. So you've got the 3 Ps which you need in order to get any change in state. They've actually looked at that, and I think it's to be commended. And I think when they roll it out and people have to consider the human impacts, the social impacts, the embodied carbon and the produced capitals, when you look at all those together, hopefully with the data presented to a client, he's more likely to make the right decision.
Very good. It really does sound as though the thinking and around the embodied carbon aspects and relationship to circularity is definitely starting to kind of crystallize and take form. Thank you. Usha, I'm going to come back to you now. I'm going to ask, if it's okay, what can be done to increase awareness of circularity and encourage its use?
I think we need to start with the language itself. We tend to use the term waste. It's not waste. We need to start using words like resource use. We talk about recycling, and most of the time when we talk about recycling, we're actually talking about downcycling. So a product having a lesser value, we should be talking about upcycling. We pay a lot more for antiques, right? So because we value that. So I think we need to start thinking differently. We need to start thinking that every bit of product of material that we use should be obviously long lasting. We shouldn't be using it if we don't need it. So we need to think about our production and consumption practices. But we also need to start thinking about where these products and materials end up. I mean, there's scores of examples of, for instance, restaurants where you pay for the food that you eat, or if you waste food, you pay extra for that. So there are different ways in which market mechanisms could be used to support the message. Here in Australia, one of the things that a lot of the green developers and builders are now bringing into the Australian psyche is to build small. You know, there's been a time when Australians were on par with the Americans in terms of our house sizes. We're a very big country. We have a small number of people, and Australians love their big houses. So, you know, the green developments are now looking at smaller houses, build small. And as part of our building codes, we're now looking at, we used to have rainwater tanks in the period of drought. We certainly have solar panels as part of one way to meet the requirements of the building code. So there are things that can be done from a policy perspective, from a code perspective, but also I think there is more awareness in certainly the younger generations in terms of the impact of climate, in terms of the value and the importance of maintaining our home, the earth, as a planet for future generations.
And out of interest, you mentioned the younger generations. Do you kind of see a sea change generally across society in your country in terms of consumers, as well as those involved in the production and generation of the built environment?
I think certainly from the perspective of students, we see a lot more awareness and a lot of interest in ensuring that some of our courses and our programs support sustainability underpinnings. And it's not just in the built environment professions, it's across the board. Right. So yes, there is a lot of interest. There's also a lot of support provided by state governments, particularly in school programs. But there has been also research that has indicated that, you know, while primary and secondary school students are very environmentally aware, when they come to university, that sort of tapers off because they're focused more on the professional programs and the technical knowledge that they get out of the programs, rather than looking at this sort of, you know, more rounded citizen of the planet sort of approach. But there's certainly things are changing. But I also thought it might be helpful to give an example in a recent work that we did looking at a deep dive into circular economy in Africa. We looked at certain countries in Africa, and I was really intrigued by this company called Upcycle Africa that were using bottles, the plastic bottles that were collected by women. So it was a source of employment for women and young people. And the plastic bottles that were not damaged were actually compacted with earth, and they were used as infill in construction. So here is an example of where creativity can also come into the picture and support local jobs, get rid or take care of something that would be a waste and an environment pollutant, and at the same time respond to some of the needs of a housing crisis. So those sort of entrepreneurial activities, I think, would be really, really helpful. And there are lots of startups across different parts of the world that would support this form of thinking.
Thank you. That's great. Before I leave that question, I just wondered, would Alan or Kevin have anything they'd like to add on what can be done to increase awareness of circularity and encourage its use?
Yeah, I like the bottle store one. That was a very good. I liked it, and at a very practical level. I thought that was amazing. There was a bottle store one done in London where they got school children to fill plastic bottles to make a bottle store house. And I think, yeah, that's that intermediate technology. It doesn't have to be technology. It doesn't have to be high tech. It just needs to be a practical example of reusing what we've got. So no, that's a fantastic example. I suppose the other very quick one, as a service, is becoming more and more popular. So instead of getting lift engineers to build it and then repair if it breaks down and getting paid to repair it, if it's issued as a service, they're more likely to give you a lift that never breaks down because it comes out of their bottom line as a service. So the more that we enter into as a service, maybe the lift will be a forever lift, and the manufacturer could actually use it again and again himself. So I think the shift to as a service has a lot to sort of help in this same way and raise awareness.
Kevin, I'm just going to connect that example with a question we've received from Monica from the floor about ownership versus leasing and services. And I think, as you've indicated there, we might see a seed shift towards service provision rather than provision of assets.
No, definitely. We were talking to Tata Steel, and if they knew the asset and they could get hold of the asset at the end, maybe they wouldn't sell the steel to a building contractor or for a building. They would lease the steel, and at the end of it, they could have the steel back because they know the quality of it when they sold it. So it's probably more beneficial to them, and then they continue to lease it all the way through its life, which is unfortunately, you have to have contractors and manufacturers having a long-term view of the asset in order to see that, in 70, 80 years time, I'm going to get the asset back. But if people can take that long-term view of assets and move into more as a service, I think there's many assets that we've never considered as assets before that could be considered, and a reduction then in the capital cost to build. The upfront capital cost will be reduced, and therefore helping more and more of these needed infrastructure projects going ahead.
Okay, Alan, have you anything on that last question before we move on?
Yeah, just to say, and just to add to what the points Kevin's already made, Ronan, that I think a demonstrable lease price advantage can be achieved through reductions in the energy costs and service charges through circular building design and the use of servitization, if you want to call it that. Because, and I think that's a fact, because I think Schiphol Airport, for example, their lighting scheme is on a service charge basis, and so it's already been done, and data is already becoming available to show that it's economically advantageous to do this. And I think that concept may be extended into, for example, air conditioning systems, etc., as well in the future.
Very good. Okay, so Kevin, I'm back to you. One last question here. What are some examples of how circularity has been incorporated into projects? Just to think in your your day-to-day experience, anything really jump out at you?
There's several little small ones. We worked with a factory in Finland that produced school buildings. These school buildings could be built, obviously, in times there's low light and inclement weather in Finland. They can produce these schools 24/7 in a factory. They're shipped then to site, and they're erected for 130 school children within 4 days. So there's very faster deployment, less disruption on site. But the good thing is, as we see schools, people moving from rural towns into cities, then people moving back to the town, and that modal shift of and the baby boom, and the fact that schools can have a flexible infrastructure that at the end of, say, a baby boom's gone through the school and the education system, that these schools could be reused, moved on to another site and used for another purpose. We did a full ESG investor advisory for the whole schools as a factory, and it came out very positive against traditional build bricks and mortar, because of the sustainability and the reuse value of those schools, which was fantastic. And another very simple one, going back to the plastic bottle one, as going back to the basics of maybe it doesn't cost a lot. So we did a review for the type of bins that go into stations and to public areas, where they made them concrete, round, solid bins, which is high in carbon to make them. But if they were to have IEDs within the actual bin, the bin itself becomes a projectile. So now they've gone back to wireframes and just clear plastic bags. Everyone can see what's in the bin. Therefore, there's less chance of people putting devices within the bins. Very simple technology. And if people understood why they've gone to this wireframe with a clear plastic bag, maybe it doesn't look as sightly seeing some waste in a bag, but if you understand the reasons why people have moved back to this clear plastic bag and this basic form of collecting waste, I think once people understand why that's done and the benefits from it, I think it's maybe some of it's educational. So some of these examples are sort of educational. We know from the design of the urban mass system that the smaller and simpler we can make the stations, the simpler we can make the infrastructure, the less invasive it is, the less operational cost it costs to maintain the station, and therefore the less ticket price to the user, the more chance that people will use public transport, and it's a massive benefit. The fact that we can use solar panels on top of the infrastructure means that we've got a revenue, second revenue, to reduce the cost of the ticket. So many simple things out there. I think the technology is out there today. I think we've got the know-how. I think we just need to get on and try and implement them and push these sort of ideas forward.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, I'm mindful of time, folks. I'm going to ask each of our panel members, by way of conclusion, what do you forecast for circularity in the built environment over the next 5 to 10 years? So, Michelle, I'll come to you first.
I think people need to be prepared for massive changes. I think there's a potential not only to sort of reinvent the language, but also to rethink how Industry 4.0, digitalization, new methods of construction, technology, all of that is going to play a really critical role, because we're now talking about if buildings are going to be used as material banks, we need to know what goes into buildings. So there's going to be RFID tags and codes going into all sorts of different things that make up our buildings. So a lot of use of technology, a shift. I think it's going to be quite a big shift in the way we think about buildings, we think about resources, and the way we operate our buildings as well. So moving more into that service-based type of models rather than an ownership type of arrangement.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I'll come to you next, Kevin.
Yeah, very, very much the same. Definitely, it'd be more use of technology, more design for manufacture assembly, because if you could design it to be assembled, you can design it to be deconstructed. Kit of parts, using that technology to lock it down, more use of blockchain and tracking assets. I think more as a service is going to come through far more, and more use of modern methods of construction. I think that's going to be key to unlocking circular economy.
And Alan, finally coming to yourself.
Thank you, Rowan. Look, I think sustainability and circular economy is an idea whose time has come post-COVID, and we've seen that in terms of the commitments governments have now to net zero by various dates around the world. But that produces a glide path of activity which they need to enact, both in terms of compliance, i.e. through building regulations, etc., but also in terms of nudging the market using, for example, the value toolkit that Kevin's already talked about. But I think in addition to that, there's vast opportunities for the surveying profession to have a conversation with their client about these issues and talk to them about how they can measure and improve the situation in terms of the sustainable and circular economy of the future. And I think we're going to see a lot of action in this space in the next 10 to 15 years because we need to make the improvements that governments have committed to.
Thank you, Alan. That's fantastic. Funny, as we went, I was just jotting down phrases and terms from technology to material banks to servitization, which I think is the first I've heard of that, and green finance and so many others. And I think, audience, you would agree with me that the possibilities and promise of a circular built environment are clearly very significant. And I think, as Alan has said, really the time has come. So I would like to, with that, thank all our panel members and our Minister for their contributions today. That's been a really kind of educational, enlightening and inspiring conversation, full of many positive ideas, I have to say, which is really encouraging for the future. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so just by way of a little reminder to the audience, folks, that we will publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar, as well as the presentation, which will be published online. And we'd be grateful if at the end of the webinar, you could take a few minutes to complete the online poll, which will appear on the screen. In terms of further opportunities to learn and take part and contribute, please do join us for another webinar as part of our WBEF COP26 mini-series. And tomorrow, there's an opportunity to see Room to Breathe, creating equality of green spaces in towns and cities. For further details, see the website rics.org/WBEF webinars. I would also, again, like to take this opportunity to express our thanks and gratitude to ASITE, the World Built Environment Forum's lead tech partner. And also to highlight to those who may not be aware that an essay competition is running, which is an opportunity to showcase the best of thinking from RICS young professionals. The judging panel will comprise of senior professionals from the built and natural environment. And if you're interested, find out more again off the website. The details are provided there. In terms of, I'd just like to highlight to everybody Dubai 22. That is the World Built Environment Forum Global Summit. Will be visiting Dubai as part of Expo 2020 Dubai, and that'll be in January 2022. And the program will focus on the livable city, agile, healthy and resilient. And if you're interested, please do visit the website rics.org/WBF for more details. Also a reminder that you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn, where you can receive news on up and coming webinars, as well as recently published articles. And finally, you can download the WBEF app from the App Store or Google Play, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content from across the built environment. And then finally, from myself, until next time, thank you and goodbye.